Back in the 1950s, members of the LGBTQ were not treated the same and were not given equal rights. This was their fight. This was the LGBTQ movement. The year was 1969. The Stonewall Inn, located in New York City, Christopher Street. It was a gay bar in which many members of the LGBTQ loved attending due to its cozy atmosphere. And it was where members of the LGBTQ were treated equally compared to everywhere else in the US. On June 28th, trouble appeared. The police, known for raiding these kinds of places as the government tells them to seek them out. This time, the police were here as they heard the Stonewall Inn was mafia-owned. The police went in and dispersed the bar's patrons. After hearing about this horrific event, many people rioted in the streets of New York. One leader in particular was Marsha P. Johnson, one of the first performers at the Stonewall Inn. She led many of the protests that appeared in the streets, as she was not angered just by the raid, but also the oppression and fear that the LGBTQ community experienced every day. These protests would soon be known as the Stonewall Riots and lasted a total of 6 days. Because of the riots, many LGBTQ-friendly groups appeared, and the fight for equal rights was finally getting traction. After that night, protests came and went until 9 years later when a horrible incident occurred. Harvey Milk, one of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, who stopped laws from being created which discriminated the LGBTQ from public accommodations, on November 27, 1978, was shot and killed by Dan White. Apparently that night, a mix of depression and stress caused Dan White to kill San Francisco Mayor George Moscone and Harvey Milk. Because of his mental state during the assassinations, Dan White was sentenced on the charge of voluntary manslaughter instead of first-degree murder. The judge ruled Dan White's sentence to be 7 years in jail. The public was confused and outraged by Dan White's sentence to 7 years in jail for the crime of 2 murders. More than 5,000 protesters went up to the San Francisco City Hall and ransacked the place, doing hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of property damage. This day was called the White Night Riots. These riots caused the state of California to abolish the diminished capacity criminal defense, which states that someone in a certain mindset or impairment is simply incapable of reaching the mental state required to commit a particular crime. The LGBTQ continued to fight, but equal rights were still not in the law until June 26, 2015, when a couple took a stand. James Obergefell and John Arthur. They were a gay couple who loved each other. When sadly, John Arthur was bound to a wheelchair because of a terminal illness he contracted. James Obergefell decided, what if we got married? And John Arthur agreed. So they went to a probate court. But it turns out, because they live in Ohio and same-sex marriage was illegal there, they weren't allowed to get married. The couple decided to travel to Maryland, as it was legal there, and they asked if they could be wedded. Maryland approved. The couple was finally married, and they lived happily ever after. That is, until sadly, John Arthur died due to his terminal illness. Ohio still refused to acknowledge the two as married and wouldn't list James as John's surviving spouse in his death certificate. James fought to the Supreme Court, where it was argued that the states had violated the Equal Protection Clause and the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment by not allowing same-sex marriages. After the Supreme Judges heard his case, on a decision split between 5 and 4 judges, it was decided that same-sex marriage is legal in all 50 states. And the ruling was final. James had won his case, and the LGBTQ community cheered. The fight for equal rights is still not over, but we have made leaps and bounds in progress. And that was the LGBTQ movement.